You know, if I had a nickel for every time this year I've seen a musicalization of a lady getting hit by a car, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's weird that it's happened twice. After 8 months of living in Fitzgerald land and working on everything from documenting his 1920s flop play, The Vegetable, to unexpectedly documenting Gatsby on Broadway, it's time to round out the trilogy of Absinthe and dive into A.R.T's Gatsby, an American Myth. With direction from Hadestown director Rachel Chafkin and music by Florence Welch of Florence and the Machine, this production's really been kept under lock and key since it was announced. But now it's time to give you a rundown on what's going on inside the giant ballroom where it happens. So buckle up, old sports, because we need to talk about Gatsby at A.R.T.
Oh, hello there, old sport. You know, with all of these parties going on, the only thing harder than our bootleg alcohol around here is getting a good night's sleep. Thankfully, Manta Sleep makes it easy to catch a few Z's in the lap of luxury. Manta's C-shaped cups and advanced material offer 100% blackout. The only way you'd get a darker night's sleep is if you were dead. Oh. But all jokes aside, Manta is honestly one of my favorite sponsors, and I don't go a night without using it. Whether you're in the swankiest hotel this side of New York City, or one of those newfangled flying contraptions, Manta guarantees a night of comfortable sleep that you don't have to sink to the bottom of a pool for. So check out Manta Sleep using the link in the description and use code WITW to get 10% off your order. Old sport. That's water.
So this is it, rounding off the trilogy of what has been really a year of Gatsby. It's not even like the summer of Gatsby, it's the 8 months of Gatsby. But we got to end the journey by doing a first for A.R.T, which they held their first ever influencer event. And so we got invited to come and see the show. It was coordinated by Rachel Green, who, if you had told me that this was the first event, I wouldn't have believed you.
It was on Harvard's campus, which right off the bat would have horrified the proud Princeton man that Fitzgerald was.
And I loved it because before the show, they took us to this little bar. I celebrated how F. Scott Fitzgerald would have wanted by getting a French 75 with an absent rinse. I'm so happy that one of the photographers there was able to capture this moment with me and Juliana when I noticed from across the bar a portrait of a young Ernest Hemingway. And so we went back to check it out, and then as we were there, we turned and looked at the side, and it was a portrait of F. Scott Fitzgerald's wife, Zelda Fitzgerald. Which, as soon as we noticed that, we brought it up, and then everybody went wild. And I really loved it, and it meant a lot because as we've been learning so much more about the Fitzgeralds, you know, Zelda really did contribute a lot to Scott's work, but was overlooked. And so it was just very therapeutic and lovely that on this night of The Great Gatsby, in the back room, everybody was taking pictures with Zelda, which was pretty great. But then we got to the actual theater, and I heard that things were really under lock and key with this thing, but this was a whole nother level where once you go through the tickets, you had to put your phone into one of the yonder pouches. So all I emerged from were my thoughts, a poster, and a couple of programs that we grabbed that you can get if you support the Kickstarter and you do the mystery playbill tier. We've got a couple Gatsby ones that we are throwing in there to help support the channel. So this is a show that I have been anticipating for a while, since they first announced it back in 2021. And it's because if you go back in my life to 2013, when my English teacher put on the Baz Luhrmann Great Gatsby soundtrack, little did I know when she did that it would become like my defining personality. Every creative decision I've made goes back to, would this fit the Great Gatsby CD? In that time, just over the past year really, we have learned so much about Fitzgerald. We've documented so much of his life, and we've talked really to some of the leading scholars and experts. And they've gone from people that we talked to just to get info to really colleagues. We talked to Anne Margaret Daniel, James L.W. West. Juliana even got to talk to Charles Scribner III, whose father and grandfather ran Charles Scribner Publishing, which published Fitzgerald's books, which is wild. And then just especially everything that happened with the Great Gatsby doc. It's just been Gatsby, Gatsby, Gatsby. And so I was really excited because this production really feels like the bookend to this era and this story that we've been telling of this nearly 100-year-old book that is still relevant today. That being said, I didn't really know a lot going into it besides that it was an all-female creative team. It was Rachel Chafkin directing, Florence Welch writing the music, Martina Mayock writing, who, reading in college, I loved Cost of Living, so I was excited to see what she brought to the table here. And Sonia Taye doing choreography, who won the Tony for Moulin Rouge and also choreographed Fox Live's Rent. So do with that as you will. But other than that, there was really nothing. There was no video coming out. There was no audio. They didn't even release the cast list until after tickets already went on sale. And they sold a ton of tickets just because the intrigue and mystery around it was so high. It's very Gatsby-esque in that way, which I can respect. And going into seeing it last week was a very interesting experience because I've been following the Broadway Gatsby for so long. And with that interpretation, there were certain things creatively that I didn't agree with as a fan of the book. Specifically, how they dealt with Myrtle's death and the whole relationship between Nick and Jordan. But again, I didn't get to take my camera in, so a lot of this is just gonna be close your eyes and visualize what I'm saying. So right off the bat, when you walk in, it is a completely different vibe visually. And one of the things that I really want to commend A.R.T. on is that they have warning signs about the violence, the suicide, the gunshots, the flashing lights. It's a very little thing to do, but it makes a huge difference because there is a lot in this show that could be triggering, specifically near the end. And so the more knowledge that people have coming into it and the more they can prepare themselves, the better. But when you walk into the Broadway version, you're met with all of this gold. It's really spectacular, and it's just drenched in that Baz Luhrmann Art Deco spectacle. This one goes to the completely other extreme, where instead of having that bright color, it's pretty muted. Basically, everything in the show is black and white, except for Gatsby's pink suit. A.R.T's Gatsby is a lot darker. It's much more minimal, and there's more of a industrial feel to it, where it's basically like everything is just crumpled metal, and it's like car pieces crumpled like a car accident throughout the whole set. And I don't know if it's recency bias because I've just seen it, but to me, the set really screamed Limpika. Big staircase and all. So Gatsby at A.R.T. starts with Nick Carraway, and he doesn't say any of the lines from the book. Really, it's more of Nick explaining who Gatsby is, and it's really planting the seeds and building up this myth of who this man that he met over the summer was. But then after that, it really follows closely to what Broadway Gatsby does, where you have a group of the ensemble people coming out, dancing, talking about the roaring 1920s, and getting a feel for the New York City environment. And we've already established that the set is more industrial, but then it starts to come out in a lot of the people's costumes as well. And it's a very little detail, but on the bottoms of their costumes, it's almost like there's rust on them, which you could also take it as blood. Me and Juliana debated for a little bit about was it blood or was it rust? Which either way adds an interesting rating to it. And this is where it started to hit, because it's like you have Broadway Gatsby, you have A.R.T. Gatsby, and their tones are so radically different. But at the heart of it, it's the Great Gatsby, so some of the same scenes are gonna happen. And when documenting for the Broadway run, when we came in to film, they were working on the second scene, and it was always the most difficult scene for the creative team because they just have that giant spectacle, big opening. And so then you go into a second scene that's supposed to showcase how careless the Buchanans are, but you have to do it in a way that doesn't slow down the momentum of the show. And the scene where Nick meets Tom, Daisy, and Jordan is really deceptive because when you first look at it, it seems like it's a pretty inconsequential scene where it's just people meeting and talking. But really, it does do that important second step of sowing the seeds to show that this beautiful palace that you're seeing is actually hiding something darker at the core. And it's hiding a lot of secrets. What I got from A.R.T's interpretation of that second scene is that it's definitely a lot more grounded and more dialogue driven, but it still doesn't quite nail it yet. And it's important as we go through and I talk to you about all this, it's important to remember that this is a pre-Broadway tryout. So it's really their first time getting it up on its feet and seeing it in front of an audience. So there's gonna be a lot that changes. That being said, with how much Gatsby means to me and how much we've learned about Gatsby, I have to call the good things good and the not so great things not so great. And a problem that I had with A.R.T. Gatsby is the same problem that I had with Broadway Gatsby, where when you meet the Buchanans, in both versions, they are way too nice. And this is something that I talked about at length with Anne Margaret Daniel, who is a genius in the Fitzgerald world. She consulted with Baz Luhrmann on the movie and took phone calls from Leo DiCaprio at 4 a.m, debating whether or not Gatsby is Hamlet or not. So Anne Margaret really knows her stuff. But after seeing the show on Broadway, we talked about how crucial it is that you get across just how selfish and self-centered the Buchanans are, because it's the only way that the larger themes of class warfare are going to come about. It draws that line in the sand, clearly defining the haves and the have-nots. I get not wanting to play the villain as the villain. It's the old Marlon Brando thing of don't play a heavy as a heavy, where it's like you want to sympathize with them and in their minds, they're not the villain. But you can't do that at the expense of the characters in a way that softens the edges. It's basically the way I see it is you have to play the Buchanans a lot like the daughters in King Lear, where when you meet them, they seem nice, they're pretty, they're innocent, but it's all just a shell hiding someone truly rotten underneath. And it's like once we get to the end of the show, you have got to hate the Buchanans because they're horrible people. And this is a difficult thing with F. Scott Fitzgerald and with The Great Gatsby, is where you're seeing it all through the eyes of Nick. So with that perspective, because Nick isn't exactly a reliable narrator, a lot of the characters come off as one-dimensional, which is purposeful. And while you can get away with that in the book, it's a lot more difficult to do on stage. While the depiction of the Buchanans left a lot to be desired, this show absolutely knocks it out of the park with how they present Myrtle, of all people. I'll be the first to admit that when I read through the book and when I watched the movie, Myrtle was always just kind of like a plot device to me, where it's like, okay, she has to come out and get hit by the car so then Gatsby can face his unfortunate end. Which, spoilers if you haven't read this nearly 100-year-old book or seen the movie. But I think it speaks volumes that the playwrights of both Broadway and A.R.T. really focused in on Myrtle and wanted to expand her storyline. And Saleha Pfeiffer just absolutely kills it with this production, because with her Myrtle, I could really feel a grounded desperation. And Myrtle is really depicted as the social climber who's sleeping with Tom Buchanan because she wants to elevate her status. That's typically how she's depicted. But with this one, you just really get that it's coming from a sense of desperation and a need to survive. They do something similar to Broadway, where they also give Myrtle a child, only in this one, she dies in the Spanish flu, which this is just something that Julianne and me have talked about a lot, where it's like, with Myrtle, with the push for Myrtle, it's that they want to show her as independent and able to stand for herself. But we just don't really understand why, in that hunt to make her a strong, independent character, they have to give her a kid in some capacity. That being said, my friend Broadway Ben on TikTok, he said something interesting where it was like Myrtle is the faux lead of this show. And I really think there's a lot of credence to that statement because looking back on the show, I don't really remember a lot of what happens with Gatsby, but I remember practically everything that happened to Myrtle. I think this should be renamed The Great Myrtle. Myrtle has so much more authority, specifically in the scene at Myrtle and Tom's love nest, which this is another one of those scenes where if you're talking about The Great Gatsby, this scene is gonna be in there, where Tom takes Nick to the apartment and they have this wild party. And it's interesting because this is a scene that on Broadway and in the movies is typically shown Myrtle's behind closed doors. But in this one, anything that would be happening behind closed doors happens right out front and center in the middle of the stage. And it's so interesting to compare how Broadway approaches this scene and how A.R.T. approaches this scene, because on Broadway, they play it off more as like a joke, and they lean into how awkward the taboo situation is. But on this one, it unapologetically leans into that freedom and the sexual liberation of it all. This especially comes through with how Nick acts in both of the scenes. Because on Broadway, it's like he's just kind of like walking around and he's like, oh, I wish they took me to the Met. And Mr. McKee, the photographer, says something like, I want to capture your musk. And Nick looks like, isn't this weird? And then kind of like walks away from the whole awkward situation. But at A.R.T., the two just start making out, which on the whole just shows how A.R.T.'s production really leans more into the freedom and the liberation of it all. And through the whole show, you can tell that Mayoke really focused in on Myrtle and that she had the most fun writing for Myrtle. Unfortunately, that means that all the other characters suffer because they aren't as fully fleshed out as Myrtle. Specifically, Gatsby. It's so funny because the title for this show is Gatsby, an American Myth. And yet, throughout the whole show, they don't really play up on the mystery of Gatsby or the lore behind who this person and this symbol is. And it's like that mystery is what makes the book and the character so exciting. It's a lot like I'm starting to watch Mad Men, and there's a lot of similarities between Don Draper and Gatsby where you don't know who this suave man is, you know he has secrets, you don't know what truth he's telling you or what he's actually lived. That is part of the allure of Great Gatsby and Gatsby himself. And it feels like both productions just don't really recognize that. And they're in such a rush to say, here's Gatsby, here's everything you need to know about him, now we're gonna kill him off in a pool. Something that I appreciate about A.R.T.'s version is that they really don't rush in introducing you to Gatsby. They really take the time to build the world, build the characters as much as they can, and then finally they introduce Gatsby. Unfortunately, and this is the same problem with Broadway, it's like they just don't know how to introduce him. With this one, it's like they kind of hint at him and his backstory, and you kind of get the feeling of who is Gatsby, but then there's no big payoff because it's just lights up and he's singing on the stairs. Same thing happened on Broadway, where it was like you have this big new money number, and then it was just lights up and they were talking in the office. And I mean, maybe it's just bad for me to say, maybe it's sacrilegious for me to say as an accidental member of the Fitzgerald Society, but I really prefer Baz Luhrmann's approach, where it's like the music is swelling and you get little glimpses at him, and then finally it builds, and it crescendos with, I'm Gatsby. And then it's like, bam. And if ever there was a moment to really embrace the theatricality of the medium, it is in that moment of you can build up so much hype and get it to where people are like, who is he? Tell us who he is. Are we about to see him? And then he turns around and there he is, and then lights out. But no place really does it. They just go really lackluster and introduce him like he's just the mid Gatsby. And it's sad because after you meet Gatsby, he just kind of becomes wallpaper. And the Great Gatsby doesn't really have a lot to do in the Great Gatsby. And it's so funny, again, because this one is called Gatsby, an American Myth, but they tell you the whole story of who he is and where he came from like a couple scenes after you meet him. And it's Wolfsheim who's kind of telling Nick, but then kind of not telling Nick who Gatsby is. And there's no Dan Cody. Like Gatsby didn't do the yacht, didn't do like the trial by water. And then you get to the end of it and you're like, well, now I'm not really interested in figuring out who this myth is because they just told me. It's not myth anymore, now it's fact. And I was so confused because there's a much better place to put it at the end when Nick is saying goodbye to Gatsby and Gatsby walks up the stairs and he goes, "That's not my name." And then he walks away and he doesn't tell Nick what his real name is. He just kind of leaves. And it's like, that would be a much better place to do that big reveal of here's who he actually is. And it's a much more rewarding way to do it because it connects the dots on everything that we've been watching for the last 2.5 hours. That being said, in this one, Gatsby is played by Isaac Powell, and it's implied that Gatsby's family is indigenous, which is fascinating, and it really changes the perspective on what is the American dream, specifically in the last 10 minutes of the show. Looking at A.R.T's Gatsby as a whole, the thing I will really praise it on is that it is not afraid to swing for the fences and take a lot of risks with the source material. And in a lot of cases, it works, like Myrtle's independence and Nick's sexual fluidity. But that being said, there are also times where it really doesn't work. And going back and thinking about that line where Nick says goodbye to Gatsby and Gatsby says, "That's not my name," it really made me notice that both Broadway and A.R.T. have moments where it feels like they just don't trust the strength of the source material. And don't get me wrong, when you're adapting or interpreting, I completely agree that the writer needs to bring a little bit of themselves and their perspective to it. Otherwise, what's the point in doing it? But that being said, there also comes a point where you need to have respect for the work and understanding the decisions and motivations behind certain lines and certain moments. And that was a big problem that I had with the Broadway version, where a pregnant Myrtle is walking to the plaza and then she says, "Oh, actually, I think I'm gonna go back to Wilson," and then she just gets hit by being in the wrong spot at the wrong time. And also just the relationship between Nick and Jordan, them getting engaged, it just isn't true to the book, and it doesn't really make sense as to why it needs to be there. And that same thing happens at A.R.T. You know, for all of their vices, Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald really had a way with words. And there's a reason that a lot of the most quotable lines from Gatsby are still quotable nearly 100 years later. So when you're writing the script and you go in and you change those memorable lines, you're facing a huge uphill battle because whatever you write is going to be compared to the original that has been around for nearly a century. And I think one of the moments in the show at A.R.T. that sums this up best is when Nick and Gatsby are talking, and it's the famous, "You can't repeat the past," and Gatsby says, "Can't repeat the past? Why, of course you can." And I love that line from Gatsby because it is so simple, but it just really speaks to the hopeless dreamer that Gatsby is, and in a way, it really spells his fate. But at A.R.T., they do that same line where Nick says, "You can't repeat the past," and Gatsby, he walks up the stairs and he turns around and goes, "Watch me." And it just doesn't really hit the same way because it's too confident, it's too bold, and it just doesn't have that wistfulness to it, that optimism tinged with doubt. But with this one, it's just the "watch me" just didn't do it for me. And this also happens with a line where Daisy is talking about her newborn child. It's one of the most gorgeous lines in all of literature, where she says, "I hope she'll be a fool. That's all a girl can be in this world, is a beautiful little fool." And this one hits a lot differently now because as we were going through the archives for the vegetable documentary, we noticed that Fitzgerald wrote that down as a note that he took from when Zelda had their first daughter, Scotty. It's something that Zelda said after she gave birth. She said that she hoped she'd be a beautiful little fool. It is the pure Zelda line that is in this book. But for some reason at A.R.T., they don't give Daisy this line, and they don't give it to a woman, which that alone rubbed me the wrong way. Instead, it shows up at the end, and it's when Nick confronts the gangster Wolfsheim, who's like Gatsby's boss. And he says, like, Gatsby would have wanted you there. And then Wolfsheim just looks at Nick and he goes, Gatsby was a fool, but damn, was he beautiful. And it was like, why it doesn't work that way. That's not the line. It would be like if in Beetlejuice the musical, instead of Lydia saying, I myself am strange and unusual, Lydia was just like, I too am weird. It's like one of those iconic lines that's iconic for a reason. And oh, I hate to say it, there's like really no variation in the music. And it hurts so bad because I remember when I listened to that Gatsby soundtrack in 2013 and I heard Florence's Over the Love, and it was like, it just took you on a journey the whole way through. The lines were so poetic. You start out and it's like simple and delicate and haunting, and then you end it with this powerful, like screaming to the heavens. And you look at the trailers and it's just like, that's it. Like, I feel something there. And that's what I really wanted out of this one. But it's just like, the way I described it to friends is it's like the whole way through, it just really feels like a hum. And a big criticism that Broadway Gatsby got was that there wasn't a lot of jazz and that it was a little bit too musical theater-y. And you can't say that about the Paper Mill Gatsby and not say it about this one too. Because I think there's just that one song really with Myrtle at the apartment that has a couple horn blasts, but other than that, there's really no jazz in this at all. I think the best way to sum up this production of Gatsby for where we're at right now is we've got three different people who have three different ideas of what a great Gatsby story needs to be, and none of them really sync up. It's like you've got the playwright, Mayoke, who really wants to lean into Myrtle and the independence there, and lost love, I would say, as a theme. And then you have Florence, who wants to present this haunting story about the American dream, I would guess. And then you have the director, Rachel Chafkin, who really wants to lean into industry, which really confused me because while industry works for Lempicka, it doesn't really work for The Great Gatsby. Specifically looking at the workers' chorus, it doesn't make a lot of sense having them here because the story is so insular and it's really focusing on a certain group of people, a handful of people. And by leaning into that industry and having the workers' chorus, it almost gave it more of like a Great Depression vibe, which that's not when Gatsby's set. It's not set in the late 1920s. It's set in the early 1920s when it was post-World War I. The economy was booming. Middle class had income that they hadn't really had before, and everybody was living loud and without consequence. And it's frustrating because with Broadway, I really wanted them to take some scenes more seriously and to lean into the tragedy a little bit more. But then with A.R.T., I wanted them to have a little bit more fun and lean into the party a little bit more. So I just wish that there was a third musical version of Gatsby that was the best of both worlds. But it's tough because, especially as I was walking out of A.R.T's Gatsby, of all things, I thought back to the SpongeBob documentary that we made. And playwright Kyle Jarrow, before he signed on to the project, he really wanted to make sure that the content matched the form and that you could justify SpongeBob as a musical. And I found myself thinking about that same thing with Gatsby, of does the content match the form? I'm not gonna say this whole thing of like, should Gatsby be a musical? Does it need, because yeah, sure it does. Like, it's art. Anything deserves to be anything. But does it work and is it effective is another question. And as far as Gatsby in the musical form, it just doesn't really work for me yet. I won't say it won't ever work. But with musicals, it's characters expressing the strongest emotions they can, and they have to sing it because their feelings are so elevated that that's the only way they can do it. And it doesn't really work with Great Gatsby, where part of what makes the book so amazing and why you can get a different interpretation every time you read it is that there is so much subtext that you can't present to the audience. And so how do you take this material that thrives on not letting the audience know everything in a medium where you have to be as open as you can to justify why you're singing? I think it does speak volumes that the moments I loved most in this production were the spoken moments and the more theatrical movement pieces, specifically with the scene where Gatsby is displaying his shirts and Nick, as the narrator, is telling you all about the different types of shirts, throwing them down to the ensemble members. It was gorgeous, and it was theatrical, and it was subtle. And then I really liked how they did the Myrtle death in this one. I kind of wish, one of my friends was telling me about an earlier version where they like lifted Myrtle up after she gets hit by the car and like spun around as if she's in midair, which I would have loved to have seen, but it's just those subtle moments where you didn't need to have like lyrical song that hit the most for me. And I think that's why you have shows like Gats, which is just 8 hours and they read the book, that worked really well. And I think it's why if you look at that 1926 Broadway version that changed basically everything about The Great Gatsby, which they could because it was 1926, nobody knew what Gatsby was. That's why I think those ones work, is because in the play form, when you're just dealing with dialogue, you're allowed to have those secrets and to have that subtext, and where you don't need to tell the audience everything and reveal everything. But in my opinion, the key to a successful Great Gatsby musical can be found at the end, when Nick is saying, "And so we beat on." For both of the productions, it's like those words just aren't enough. At A.R.T, they come out and they sing it. They sing the whole thing with this huge like ensemble. They go, "And so we beat on," and then the lights go out. And then on Broadway, you can't even hear Nick say the lines because there's just a party roaring behind him and he's just yelling the lines. What I wish that both versions of this would do, and to any of you out there who are writing your own version of the Great Gatsby musical, is please just let those last few lines carry the show. Because you don't need to fix the ending. The ending is literally handed to you. We talked about it a lot with The Vegetable. When F. Scott Fitzgerald was writing The Great Gatsby, his mind was still in theater world from that play. And that ending is the most theatrical ending that you could ask for. Just let it hit. I really think that the success of this production and all future productions of The Great Gatsby hinge on that. It is that you just have to let The Great Gatsby be The Great Gatsby. With that being said, now that you've heard my thoughts on A.R.T's Gatsby, what if you go and you take a peek behind the curtain at some of the challenges and triumphs that the team had taking it to Broadway? Click on this video to learn more about the roaring history behind The Great Gatsby on Broadway.